Hi there, my name is Corey Johnston.
And I'm Michelle Maunder.
And you are listening to Spirited Conversations, engaging and elevating pediatric occupational therapists, a joint collaboration between SEED Pediatric Services and Developmental FX. Each week, you'll hear from myself and Michelle as we nerd out with Tracy Stackhouse. Just a note before we start, Spirited Conversations is for informational purposes only. We're not intending to be a substitute for professional medical advice or therapeutic intervention. We urge you to seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health professionals with any questions you have regarding specific medical conditions. With that, let's jump into today's episode. Hello, welcome. It's episode 2. Hi, Tracy. How are you?
I'm great. How are you guys down there?
Yeah, good. You, Michelle?
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
Ready to go.
Excited.
I am too. So today I have brought a composite case that I think will be really, really helpful for everybody, particularly because at the end of our last episode, we were sort of alluding to postural functions, and I assessed this little kiddo not that long ago, and I was like, you're perfect. So this is a little 12-year-old boy, and he came in to the clinic to get assessed, mostly actually for handwriting challenges. So really having difficulty with legibility, not able to get his ideas out onto paper, and they basically wanted supports for school and to know how they could help him show his best academic potential, I guess. And so in the clinic, I did the 3 BERI, so the VMI, the visual perceptual test, and the motor coordination test. I also did the handwriting print tool, which is from the Handwriting Without Tears program. And I also did the handwriting speed test. And then just because I think it's so helpful to know about the postural system when you're assessing handwriting, I also did the COMPS with a few extra. So the COMPS is the clinical observation of motor and postural skills. And I added in a few extra clinical observations that aren't formally on that assessment, but that I think are really helpful for me. So I know that, Tracy, I've been to your lectures and you've got really great postural models that I think might help us with talking about this kiddo. So should we chat about that?
Yeah, let's jump into talking about that. So I think in the show notes, we'll go ahead and pop up one of the visuals that I find really useful and often use both in training, but even in my own clinical work. And what I find helpful in clinical reasoning is to have some visual models so that when you're doing an assessment, when you're treating a child, when you're consulting, when you're just trying to think it through, that you can kind of pause and reflect and organize your thoughts. And so visual tools are super helpful to that end. And I think throughout this series, all of the different episodes, we'll be sharing different visual tools like this because they're really helpful. And especially in a podcast forum, because we need to be able to kind of see what we're talking about sometimes. And because this is an auditory mechanism, we're going to kind of have that visual. So I think it's going to anchor us a little bit. So one of the visuals is just this kind of flow chart, and it comes to us from the combined models that are really around just core development. And the model is drawn from an NDT and neurodevelopmental treatment perspective, but is also integrated from a sensory integrative perspective. And those two interventions are core to what we do in pediatric OT anyway. And they're really going to underpin those assessments that you did, Corey. So when you were testing this little guy, what's interesting is that the tests themselves are kind of measuring either like speed of handwriting, or they're measuring like a visual motor integration skill or capacity. But all of those things are related to underlying sensory motor functions. And we don't always have tests for all those sensory motor functions. So where clinical reasoning is really critical is helping you to interpret test data, helping you to interpret observation data, and then interpret that in a way that leads you to the clarity that you need for a really concise and obvious treatment plan, and also for guiding teachers and school teams and parents. So this gap between the data of the testing and the clinical treatment plan, it's really fascinating how there's always that gap.
And I'm just thinking about it, that what you are measuring is the output. And so what we're going to talk about is the inputs, I guess. Is that what you're saying, Tracy? Like the underlying inputs that allow or facilitate or restrict him to handwrite, which is the output.
Absolutely. That's a great way to think about it. And really, if you think about sensory integration as the organization of sensation for use, that's exactly what we're talking about. So on some level, Dr. Ayers always wins, and she always kind of has like the framework that allows us to dive to that level of zooming into the input, what is going on in the underlying performance components. And then how is that restricting that output in the daily life and daily function and daily occupation? So here we are talking about the joy and purity and beauty of our profession, really. And it's the piece that people don't always understand, but I think when we get to it, it's so juicy and so amazing. So in this visual model that we're referring to, the concept is to sort of look at the sensory postural triad. And sometimes we call that now a sensory postural quadrad. We'll get into talking about why.
I've heard that
before. New. But, in the classic neurosciences, there's this relationship between visual, vestibular, and proprioceptive processing. And those are the cornerstones, in addition to that auditory partner, the quadrad. But those are the cornerstones of postural adaptation. And so as you go to do an assessment and you notice that this little person, or this not little person, but 12-year-old was struggling with fine motor control, but then there were probably some really interesting findings throughout the postural system. Yeah. And you looked at clinical observations that included, balance and reflex integration and anti-gravity control. So tell us a little bit more about those findings, and then we'll kind of use this visual to start to organize our thoughts around that.
Okay, that sounds good. So even in I will definitely talk about his performance in the clinical observations in each of those tasks. But even in the Beery, while he was copying the shapes or doing the fine motor control, there was a lot of shifting of body weight. So anytime he had to sort of draw, so he was using his right hand, and anytime he had to draw on the left side of the paper, he would shift his whole body over to the side to draw the shape, or he would turn. And so I immediately am thinking about his midline and how organized he is in that space, and whether he's, efficiently able to cross his midline without any trouble. But the fascinating thing as well was he asked me, do I have to hold the paper with my other hand? So that was really, really funny, because I was like, oh, you don't have to,
what
do
else
it
are you
if,
gonna
do it if you want to. So something that should be super automatic, he's obviously been taught to do, or has knows that that's something he should do, but he was kind of propping himself up with that arm. So he was like, do I have to hold the page with my other hand?
Because I really want to hold myself up.
Yes. And it that was so funny to me. And I just said, well, whatever works for you. And so that was very interesting, just in that observation itself. So then when I came to do the handwriting speed test, there was a lot of postural fatigue. So what I'm meaning by that is resting my head, so holding my head up with my arm, and shaking. So stopping what I'm doing, even though it's a timed test, like it's a 3-minute test, write as many words as you can, as neatly as you can. And he's stopping and he's sort of like shaking his hand out, and then he's leaning on his head. And so it didn't seem as though there was an urgency to what he was doing. And then if I looked at what he was writing, as he went through the test and fatigued, the legibility just went way down. He just got more and more tired, and everything just kind of went out the window.
So his accuracy went out the window.
Yeah.
Did the size get bigger?
Yep, size got bigger. Even spacing between words, like it was hard sometimes to see where he'd ended one word and started the next. And that test isn't necessarily about legibility. It's just purely about speed. But it gave me a good indication, like, you know, if you're struggling with 3 minutes of writing, it's going to look, I'm sure, pretty terrible if you have to do a whole writing task at school.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
an assessment task.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So any test where he's going to have to write a decent amount of writing is going to be, I'm sure, really fatiguing. And then potentially he's not going to be able to get the marks because you can't read what he's writing.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so when you think about, you know, handwriting drifting and sort of, you know, the struggle that happens pretty quickly. And then you also noticed background postural difficulties right away. It is going to be really critical for this little one to really have those postural functions better understood and really addressed directly in intervention, because you aren't going to really be able to build enough strength and enough sort of work tolerance and enough skillfulness to sustain beyond a few minutes without the background postural system being able to automatically subserve the control and stability function and just maintain that for long periods of time. So by the time a child is 12 years old, we would really expect that they would have an ability to write for, you know, long periods of time, 30, 40 minutes without a super amount of fatigue. And so this person is just really like at about 10% of what you would expect in terms of that fatigue quality.
Yeah.
And so we want to really back up and understand what's happening in that postural system. And you mentioned a couple of things about how, you know, midline orientation, crossing the midline were obvious. And sometimes those really big the functions that are at the higher end of this visual chart that we're going to refer to, they're often really glaring and obvious to see. So you'll see that on the left-hand side of the chart, midline stability is kind of hanging out up at the top. Okay. And it's a pretty obvious skill. So when kids are struggling with midline function, it's not obvious to maybe everybody, but for occupational therapists, I think in particular, we're pretty tuned into looking for that. Yeah. And we see it and it becomes fairly obvious. And equilibrium.
And it's fascinating to me that in the task, like, sounds like not many minutes that he was doing it. Yeah. He was already looking for strategies to accommodate for that. So whether he'd sat at the desk for 10 minutes only and was about to do a 3-minute task, he was working it. He was like, oh, can I put my hand here because I'm already exhausted? And, you know, so
before he even started,
but he's got some strategies to work around it. He's postural stability and midline challenges, I guess.
Yeah, and I think as well, you know, there's, like you said, before you even start, you can almost get a sense of what their postural system looks like by the way that they sit in the chair and just, I guess, the effort that you can see them putting into the task. And sometimes I can't 100% remember, but sometimes you'll see that mouth kind of like tongue sticking out and jaw opening and all of that sort of stuff to try and help me get my hands to work and to do this activity. And then you just think, wow, how hard it would be for you being 12 in class and then working all day, and you can't even sit here and do these not super difficult activities for 10 minutes and you're really
And he's
working
eager to
hard.
comply. So
Yeah.
he's kind of trying to do his
Yeah.
best, but it's like, oh, I just need to put my hand here.
Yeah,
So
and
he's,
so sweet around, do I have to put my hand there? Like, asking, like,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that was how wonderful, because we know that isn't necessarily the way that every child copes is, through being very sweet and cooperative. And especially when basic things like anti-gravity control, finding my stability upright against gravity and being able to maintain that for a long period of time, when that's really hard for you and fatigue comes over you, it's quite common for kids like that to start to feel a little bit low and slow about the world, about their own selves, about relationships sometimes. And so the fact that this 12-year-old is really finding a robust kind of empathy and kindness, self-compassion, kind of kindness to himself, that's really cool. And I love that so much. But it doesn't help him at all in terms of his postural control. So when we think about, midline issues, and then you start to look underneath that, tell us a little bit about what you talked about how he was kind of tipping off of midline, not finding alignment in his midline. And sometimes we call that vertical riding. It's this kind of upright middle anti-gravity control position. And he kind of slumps over and leans. And so sometimes kids do that because of low muscle tone. Sometimes they do that because their sense of their midline, their somatosensory and vestibular sense of their midline is off. Sometimes they do it because of just fatigue and endurance issues and strength. And that can be related to the first one I listed, the muscle tone issue. But then they sometimes also do it because every time that you start to move off of your midline, it pulls for basic sensory motor patterns. And sometimes what happens is that you are stronger in a way if you use a fixing in a pattern instead of just having the ease and fluidity of just maintaining the upright posture. And so there can be all kinds of things lurking underneath the description you've given us so far. And I'm really curious to hear more about some of the assessments, the clinical observations you did, and kind of what that'll help us to understand in terms of these pieces that are lower down in this visual chart.
Yeah, sure. So I did the standard prone extension. I might list out what I did and then I can go through some of the observations for you. So I did the prone extension, I did supine flexion, I did rapid forearm rotations, I did finger nose touching, and the one where you have one hand out in front and then your finger coming from your nose to your hand in front of your face. I did ATNR. I did, there's one other in the comps that I did. Oh, the slow movements. And then I also did some extras. So I just did the standard standing on one leg, ocular tracking. So smooth pursuits and saccadic eye movements. I did a tonic lab test. And I think I did a few others, but
any movement? Like, I'm interested in how he moves. So catching a ball, kicking a ball.
I didn't do any catching or kicking a ball. I did some rolling. But I think other than that, I didn't do a whole ton of movement. I just did the standard clinobs. But it struck me that, one of the biggest obvious issues that I saw, that I was like, wow, like that's really not pulled together for a 12-year-old was his ocular tracking. I mean, his prone extension and supine flexion were really poor quality in that when he lay on his stomach and tried to lift up, he found it really hard. He found it really hard to get his legs, his chest, his head and arms off the ground. He couldn't sustain it. And he said, wow, that was really hard after he'd done it. And I was like, yeah, I can see that's really tricky for you. And then the same on his back when he went up into that supine flexion. he first of all couldn't even do it as one movement. So he had to sort of lift his legs and then his arm and then he couldn't just do it all as one. And then his quality of chin tuck and actual flexion it wasn't really great. So he didn't look super flexed in that position. And I asked him which one was harder, which one was more difficult. And he said the prone extension he said that was really hard. I said, okay, no worries. And curious, when I tested his tracking, so just purely smooth pursuits in the horizontal plane, he had some massive jumps, like really big jumps of his eyes away from the object that he was tracking at midline. And I hadn't seen that for a while. Like I've usually will see some flickering or some, what happened there? And I lost the target and then I brought my eyes back on, but his eyes really jumped away from the target. And then I asked him, I said, how do you go with reading? Like, do you ever feel like you skip words or you miss things? He's like, oh yeah, I have to reread the same thing a lot of times sometimes to really actually read it properly. And it didn't surprise me at all. Same with the saccadic eye movement. He would overshoot the mark. He frowned and squinted and his eyes were watering. Like he was really working hard. Yeah. And I said, this is really hard. We won't do too many more. Because I know that I don't like doing that test because I find that a little, sometimes a little hard for myself. So I really feel for kids when they're working so hard at it, and I just know how uncomfortable it can feel.
Oh, and everything was working really hard. Yeah. It sounded like you didn't land on anything, all that you're describing that came easy. So it's this cumulative
and then
effect of, what are you doing to me?
Right. I did really feel for him because I was like, you are working really hard for me right now. And I appreciate how hard you're working and you're not putting up a fight, right? So the other fascinating thing was when I did his tonic labyrinthine reflex test, where I had him stand with his feet together and his hands beside his side and got him to close his eyes and just slowly tipped his head back in space and just asked him to hold that position. He looked really, really uncomfortable. So his eyes started fluttering. He was swallowing. His cheeks got flushed. And I thought he was going to fall over. So I sort of grabbed onto him so that he didn't fall, and he flinched like really badly.
Like a startle.
Yeah, like a really big startle. And I said, I'm so sorry. I thought you were going to fall, so I just sort of wanted to catch you so you didn't fall over. But yeah, so I guess I came away thinking even potentially like a tactile processing issue. I mean, I don't know if that's there as well, or if that was just I got a fright because my eyes were closed and I didn't know that you were going to do that. Even though I said I'm going to put my hands here in case, So that was fascinating to me, and I thought, well, that's probably going in with this quadrad that you're talking about around this vestibular processing piece where he's not able to sort of get up against gravity, as well as proprioceptive issues around where's my body in space and coordinating my body together. And then I thought, there could be some tactile issues as well thrown in the mix. And there's definitely a visual tracking, like a ocular tracking issue. So I don't know, does that help give you a bit more information about how he performed?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are so many pieces there. So it feels like if we just looking at the visual graphic as kind of an organizer, all the way down the left-hand side. So, and so we can, use this chart in up, down, back and forth kinds of thinking. But if you look at the functions that you've described really very specifically on the left-hand side, he's really struggling with all of those functions. So his alignment and stability and holding patterns are really weak. He has still retained tonic reflexes, and the tonic reflexes and anti-gravity control in supine flexion and in prone extension start to be really critical observations to make when when you start to have the clustering of difficulties that this little guy or this guy, I keep calling him little, but I don't know why I'm picturing him that way. Maybe it's just because his nervous system's a little vulnerable and it feels young to me.
Yeah.
And so it just keeps pulling me to little. So when you see that level of processing issue, it is going to be very likely that we're going to need to look super specifically at the vestibular processing mechanism. So the tonic labyrinthine reflex, the actual labyrinth is the vestibular labyrinth. That's what you're triggering.
Yeah, right.
And when you move the head out of alignment, the head neck complex out of alignment, especially when you occlude vision, which is how you kind of standardly do that test.
Yeah.
So you don't have the horizon to organize around, and you're tipping the canals and the superior and inferior semicircular canals deep inside the deep partners of the vestibular apparatus, when they're set up to work in opposition to each other. So if there's a sudden influx of information to the inferior or superior canal as you tip the head through space, that relationship, what that does is it right away changes the tonic activation of the flexion and extension throughout your whole trunk. It changes it also in your extremities. And so, but really importantly, the vestibular function, it organizes not just its response in relation to the input of the head neck complex, but it's really around the neck proprioceptors and this firing off of the neck proprioceptors. So what you saw with the visual flickering is that as the head is moved and the neck proprioceptors are stimulated, they're trying to recruit that visual partner to say, what is going on out there? Why are we moving? Why are we moving? Because my body is standing still, but now my head is moving. And so often what you're going to see is that the nervous system does this adaptive response of trying to say, help me out, partners, help me out. I'm recruiting information. And so the recruitment of information is going to stimulate through the MLF pathway, the medial longitudinal fasciculus, this sort of neck proprioceptor vestibular complex that then is going to communicate up to the eye muscles. Right. And it's going to pull on those eye muscles to say what's going on out there.
Right.
And when you occlude vision, even if you don't occlude vision, what you can start to see is some level of automatic eye muscle movement, nystagmus, we sometimes call that, but it's this kind of response of the eye muscles to trigger and say, give me information. I need you to localize. I need you to find your midline. I need to find stability patterns. And the vestibular system, whenever it is moved in the tonic sense, it really asks the whole postural system to find stability. And so when it can't find stability, it really becomes an autonomic event. And, it's so interesting because now in our world, we have new theories, polyvagal theory in particular, that have really started to come in to help us have a different level of understanding. But Dr. Ayers, all the way back in the early 1970s, wrote a lot about this. Even in the Blue Sensory Integration and Learning Disorders book, she writes about how the tonic labyrinthine, when you see it fire off in a way like you just heard described, that you're going to really see it as being an autonomic level of dysregulation, that it's pretty low and deep in the nervous system, that you're seeing disruption from this. And so I think that this, this child is really struggling with a really deep level of vestibular integration problem. Yeah. And how you're seeing that show up is in weak postural adaptation. And then that's leading to weak ocular function and then weak handwriting. Yeah. And so it goes all the way through the system, all the way from basic vestibular through the postural adaptation system into this daily life activity. It's pretty full-on, beautiful representation of Dr. Ayers' work and why the work we all do is so critically important.
Yeah.
Wow, that's got such a pervasive effect on him. Tracy, I'm just wanting to go back to the vestib function. So when we do that test, we are tilting the head backwards slowly. So if the vestibular system is processing well, there should be no need to recruit. So if I'm having Corey tilt my head back, I typically should not need to open my eyes. Is that right?
Yeah, once you have integration, right? So we'll always use the word integration because it's so real. But when you have the integration of this function, what happens is that as you tip your head back, you make postural adjustments. So you're still feeling the somatosensory sense of your body in space. You know you're connected to the ground. You know you're upright against gravity. And you know you're not moving because you have integrity in the vestibular somatosensory relationship. And so as you tip your head back, what happens is that you're going to always get a differential firing of the muscle groups that are on the front and back sides of your body. And so even in you and I, if we were to put...
that's to accommodate for that change in a head position, specifically the vestibular system.
Yeah, it is. It's to accommodate for it. And it's partly because your center of gravity is now shifted. So if you're standing steady, so everybody even listening, just stand steady and kind of orient your eyes straight on the horizon and have your nose kind of straight out. And what I want you to do is just take a breath and feel your center of gravity. And wherever that is. Now, if you just tip your own head back, what you're going to notice is that your center of gravity is going to rise maybe 2 to 5 inches. Do you notice that?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. So that's just because what you've done now is you've moved out of a balance in the sagittal plane of the flexion extension muscle groupings, and you have raised the center of gravity. So now you're going to have a differential firing pattern. If we put an EMG on you, you would have activation all the way through the whole muscle synergy from the tip of your toes to the top of your head. And it's going to compensate for that change in center of gravity. Center of gravity is where we align around that, and our 3-4 dimensional midlines are all organized around our center of gravity and our base of support. So when the relationship between center of gravity and base of support moves, there has to be a muscle response. Some people over attribute that to the reflexes now taking over. No, the reflex is there to help you. Okay, so we all have that tonic labyrinthine reflex, but what happens is that when you can't integrate it, when you can't integrate that my head tipped back and I can't adjust to my now higher center of gravity, the relative muscle activation of the ventral and dorsal surfaces being activated, that's going to make me feel disorganized because I'm used to my center of gravity being lower than that.
All right. So he's not in this, like what we're talking about, there's a potential here that because of the underlying issues around processing the information from the labyrinth of the vestibular system, is when you tip him, he then loses all of his center of where he has his center of gravity and where his base of support sits. And when you tip him and move his head, if that changes, he then doesn't know what to do with that information. Is that just
we just didn't automatically make adjustments to accommodate for a change? Is that right?
I was just thinking about the sensation for me. Like, so when you were saying, everybody listening, put your nose just straight out and then just take a breath and see where you feel, and then tip your head back and see how that changes. I guess because of the way our vestibular system organizes, does that, when each change of center of gravity for ourselves, when we experience changes of center of gravity, if we have integration around the vestibular system, we then know what to do posturally with each of those changes? Is that without that, then we don't know what to do with it and we recruit help? Is that kind of...
That's precisely it.
Oh,
That's
awesome.
exactly the definition of postural adaptation.
Yeah, cool.
And postural adaptation is one of the most important automatic functions that stays integrated all day long as everything is moving and constantly changing. And it's the biggest, one of the most primary products of sensory integrative processing.
Right.
So postural adaptation in and of itself is an outcome of quality sensory integration, of the real integrity of sensory integration. And when you see a breakdown in postural adaptation, like we see in this little one, in this youngster, then you're going to really see that that's a reflection of weak sensory integrative functions. So when you go to try to treatment plan for a child like this, there are lots of different treatment approaches. And what we want to do is not get stuck on any one of them, but really work toward integration. Yeah. So we are going to acknowledge that there are difficulties with reflex integration. From an AIRS perspective, you work on reflex integration by using enhanced vestibular somatosensory experiences, but in a postural context. And sometimes people miss this. So I love that we get to talk about this today, because
break it down for us, Tracy. Break it down.
It's just one of those really important parts of the work and of the legacy of Dr. Ayers' work that sometimes gets lost, I think. So, the idea is that you are really on purpose choosing movement activities for the child that puts them in positions that requires them to work in opposition to the reflexes that are kind of disorganizing them or looking the most unintegrated. Yeah. So for a TLR, Dr. Ayers wrote really specifically that you're going to work in prone extension a lot. Yeah. And because this, youngster doesn't have organization of prone extension anyway, we would have chosen that anyway. Yeah. But we're going to really want to use like a scooter board ramp and get fast linear acceleration to build through the vestibulospinal pathway the quick fire of muscle tone, bring into phasic activation some anti-gravity control, and then let that vestibular activation help the nervous system drive the muscle control, the anti-gravity extensor muscle control. And then once we've got that as kind of a priming, then we're going to want to work in active prone extension to build the strength of that tonic activation against gravity. And that becomes almost like formulaic in our treatment. Dr. Ayers wrote it way back in the late 60s, early 70s, and it remains so consistently true across different treatment approaches that it's really the cornerstone. So that's cool, I think, that there's so much clarity about what it is that you would sort of target.
Yeah, right. So wait, can I just clarify one thing? So I'm just thinking about other kids that I've popped on scooter boards before, trying to get some of that fast linear input into the vestibular system to fire up the muscles of extension. And they start with such poor quality, like on the scooter board, and you're like, oh, I'm kind of nervous about you even getting on this thing, and they're not super aware of their body, and sometimes they run over their fingers or, all of that stuff. But sometimes I'll put that same kid, or I guess coming back to the scooter board activity, they might start that way. And then after 3 or 4 goes, you start to see it come on. And as long as they're not one of those kids that are truly afraid of movement, of vestibular input, they're willing to do it usually.
Like a gravitational insecurity. Yeah. Is that what you're meaning? So they're not truly that.
Yeah, because with those kiddos, they won't get on the scooter board, right? Mm-hmm. But so then you kind of do start to see it come on. But are you saying after so say I've got a kid who I have just done some fast linear input with down a scooter board ramp. Is there a significance of it being downward angled like that, Tracy?
Yeah, there absolutely is. So part of it is that, again, the TLR, the tonic labyrinthine, is going to be communicating about the discrepancy in position between the superior and inferior canals. And when the relationship in that changes, then you get a different firing signal.
Okay.
So when you're in a little bit of, head inversion, it's going to do two things for you. First of all, it's going to orient so that the superior canal is tipped forward, and that's going to activate extensor control more than flexor control. And that's what we want in this situation. Yeah. The second thing that it does is it, activates through the baroreceptors a little bit of a dampening of the overwhelm that's happening autonomically.
Yeah.
And so even though
inhibition, we're going to give him a little bit of inhibition so he doesn't freak out.
Yeah.
Because this will feel intense for him.
Yes.
That's exactly right. And so this is the kind of, thing where what you said, Corey, I think in a treatment situation with a child, you have to kind of inch toward this. You don't impose fast linear activation. Yeah. If the kid is too afraid, or their experience thus far has been, this is not successful for me and I don't enjoy this and please stop it, then we don't just go forward, right? So we're going to create the opportunity for that to be successful. But this is what we know the nervous system needs. So you don't have to do it through a scooter board ramp. You can, hang up platform swings, lycra swings. You can invert them slightly so that you're getting the same activation. You can even use like an inflatable, like a whale or a pillow, and kind of do some moving on there. And so you're going to really explore movement, but your goal as the clinician is to follow, how does that organize the child? Where do they find joy and exploration there? How do they pull that system together? And how do we start to see that anti-gravity control is starting to improve? Yeah. And what we're really wanting is the partner of the vestibular activation to help us with the postural adaptation. And then we want to work in postural adaptation to work on control against gravity, to work on riding vertically. We want to start to seam the the sagittal plane together through lateral and then rotary movements. So we're going to start to pull in some of our knowledge of normal developmental movement patterns and how those help us. So in the treatment sequence, you're really weaving together across postural adaptation from vestibular function up into postural control. Okay. And you're just following that carefully. This is also one of the interventions that we've really come to understand that if we can add some sound activation, it's probably going to be a super powerhouse for us because the partner of sound with the vestibular apparatus starts to give a sense of synchrony and oscillation, and that basic vibratory quality of somatosensory grabbing that tone, that rhythm, that beat really fuels the deep proprioceptors, the deep somatosensory receptors, and also vestibular function. And together, all of that starts to create a different kind of context that the postural adaptation system starts to get enough richness that it grabs onto that information in an integrative way. And so I know when I'm treating kiddos like this, I really like to weave those pieces together because I find that it just really accelerates progress differently than if I don't put all those pieces together.
Because it adds another group of sensations to add intensity to it, or is it the base with which he can start to organize around?
It's really both. It's really both, because at the bottom of our chart here, like I said, it's kind of the classic triad, but really the auditory system is such a partner to to the whole system.
Yeah.
Our postural system gives us both that sustained anti-gravity control so that we can be upright and engaged and start to use our eyes to scan and track and take in the world close and far, to take in sound close and far, to use our extremities close and far. And that adaptive function of the postural system always includes organizing your body in space.
Yeah.
And the sound system helps you tremendously with that. So I think, at some point we'll have an episode maybe where we talk more about auditory as a particular focus. But really what we want to focus on here is in postural adaptation, we want to analyze the vestibular, somatosensory, visual, and auditory functions and pull them, and then really on purpose start to use them to build the holding stability patterns for the purpose of really fluid movement off of the midline, where the midline is always the referent point. And so the midline is the referent point for the core postural system, for your gross motor actions, for your big body actions. It's true for your eyes too, right? And you talked early on, Corey, about how this, when you evaluated this young boy, that he really was struggling with being able to deal with any ocular pursuit across the midline. Yeah. So as soon as he started to get to the midline, his eyes would jump. So that's a real particular ocular finding that is indicative of a vestibular-based processing issue that underlies the ocular problem. Yeah. And so we kind of know that from the data that you already collected on him. Yeah. But what we want to do is really look at how the midline organization is going to support that. And as the vestibular function starts to support postural adaptation and you start to have core postural development that's really strengthened, and you're going to see that with that prone extension becoming really much more at ease. And one of the markers, the real hallmarks there, is that you get a kind of an elegant look to that prone extension, right? And so the integration of flexion extension produces this kind of controlled anti-gravity control. And really importantly, what you get is no break in the neck complex as the extension occurs. Yeah, okay. And that starts to tell you that the vestibular somatosensory relationship that we talked about earlier is starting to be organized. And once that starts to happen, you'll start to see that ocular pursuit starts to smooth out.
Yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to recap something because I feel like I got something here that sometimes it's easy to forget. But so you were talking about we fire up, we give input to vestibular function. So we ideally fast linear input with that slight inversion. So going down the ramp with the head first. That, I guess the function of that is to help provide input to the vestibular system, right? But then you were talking about then what we actually want to target is the postural challenges. So we provide the input, we hopefully get the system firing.
Internal activation.
Yeah. Yep. So the system does some sort of internal signaling that for whatever reason hasn't been super efficient prior to now. And so we're increasing and enhancing that so that we can get better postural function, so better uprightness. And then you were talking about, so once I have that input provided, then I'm going to go into the postural system because that's where we're seeing such huge issues, to then work in moving my body in space and finding alignment and enjoying the experience of moving my body because I now have activation that I can work off of. Is that where we're going from?
Yeah, that's right. Okay. And then you're going to have all kinds of really fun opportunities to explore, moving through space with all different qualities, finding balance and equilibrium in all different levels of challenge, dynamic and static challenges. And that system is going to really synchronize and organize. So at the end of the day, postural adaptation is super deeply related to functions like balance and bilateral coordination. And we didn't get into, and midline. Yeah. That's right. So those skills that are at the higher end of this. But so it's all the postural adaptation system as you work from the sensory base through the sensory motor functions that support it. That's what gives the background automatic capacity to be a handwriter that he doesn't have.
Wow, what a great way to end.
I love that. And I love that it's automatic. Yeah. Like he shouldn't have to think about it, and he shouldn't have to plan for it, so that when he tilts his head back or whatever, that his body integrates that new input and
adapts posturally.
Adapts, to whatever demands you're doing. So follow this visual thing, hop in this posture and hold, move in and out of this. Yeah. Anyway, so it's all automatic for him.
Yeah. Oh. And when it's not automatic, you get breakdowns.
Yes.
In function.
Yeah, when it's not automatic, you have to lean on your arm and then you have to stop after 2 minutes.
Yes.
And it doesn't get better with practice. No. You only get better by addressing the underpinning. Yeah. And that's the beauty of the work that we do. So what a great case, Corey.
Yay.
I love it.
Thanks, Tracy. That was awesome. That was great.
Perfect.
We will put the link up in the show notes for that postural graphic that Tracy was. Who put that picture together? So that
graphic has been adapted over the years, but it really came from Ann Grady, who was one of my bosses, and she did a lot of teaching in the world of neurodevelopmental treatment in NDT, but she was also taught a lot of courses just on development and how do we support kids in their development and their occupational performance. So that chart really was adapted from Ann Grady from years ago at Children's Hospital in Denver. And it's a joy to be able to share it in this form.
It was really useful to unpack it using that image. So thanks for bringing that. Tracy, that's accessible for everybody else to
have a look at
while they listen on.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Each episode, we're going to give you our key points from our discussion. So for this episode, I'm going to share with you, and I think my first point is that the postural system is so vital for so many skills that we do in our lives, and it has such a significant effect on handwriting function. The second thing that I really took away from today is that the vestibular system has such a profound effect on where I feel my center of gravity is. And when my head position changes, my center of gravity feels so different. I think that was such a aha moment for me. And then the last thing that I took away from today is the power of fast linear movement for setting up good quality sustained extension. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Fantastic.
All right.
See you next time. Bye. This podcast is brought to you by Seed Pediatric Services and Developmental FX, produced by Little Image Co. For more information, please go to our show notes on our website, spiritedconversationspodcast.com, or catch us at our Seed and Developmental FX Facebook or Insta pages. So grateful to have you with us today for this episode. Take care, and we'll see you next time.